Welcome, everybody, to the Jewish Study Center. This is a class organized and actually co-sponsored with the Sephardic Heritage International, DC. I'll talk about that. You'll learn about that in a few minutes. I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I am the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center, and as such, I usually make a pitch because our classes are free, but we do have expenses, so we encourage people to make donations. We don't mandate it. We don't give you exactly what, we don't say how much to give. Give as much as you want. Go to our to donate. Go to our website, which is www.jewishstudycenter.org, and click on donate, and then you click on donating from your PayPal account or from your credit card or by check. If you click on check, it'll tell you where to send a check. And if you do donate with your credit card, PayPal will process it, but it won't put you into PayPal or anything of that nature. As you all should realize, this is being recorded, and after the class is over, I will put the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to everybody where the recording is. Meanwhile, you also should notice that the closed captions are on, so if you can't hear or understand the accent of me or whoever else could be talking, you can just look at the closed caption. Now, everybody's muted, but we do want your comments and your questions. So put your comments and your questions in the chat box. Address them to everybody. Sometimes you put a question in, someone else in the audience will give you an answer or give you a comment, whatever. After the official presentation is over, Mindy Reiser, who is our vice president, will conduct a Q&A session. She'll take the questions that you have, or as many as possible, from the chat box and combine a few, etc., and do a few of her own, and we'll have a Q&A session after the actual presentation is over. Okay, so I think now, as tech director, the next is, since this is a class which is really organized by the Sephardic Heritage International, the director, Ephraim Katzir, will actually introduce the speaker and the topic for the day. So, Ephraim, you are on now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ephraim Katzir. I'm the founding director of Sephardic Heritage International, or SHIN-DC. I'd like to thank the Jewish Study Center for partnering with SHIN-DC on this program. I'd also like to thank our other community partners, the Generations After, our Sephardic Family, and the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Thanks also to those who have joined us from Jewish community in Sarajevo, which may include Hazan Igor Ben-Sion Kozhemyakin. Sephardic Heritage International, or SHIN-DC, is a pluralistic 501c3 arts and humanities organization that builds intercultural bridges of understanding while raising awareness of Sephardic and other underrepresented Jewish heritages and the cultures, arts, and history of Africa, the Balkans, and Asia. We encourage you to support SHIN-DC's work by making a donation on our website, shindc.org, SHINDC.org, or more specifically for donations, please go to shindc.org/donate. One of SHIN-DC's activities is organizing since 2019 the annual Congressional Holocaust commemoration that aims to bring often omitted Sephardic narratives into focus. Dark Shadows Hover is very relevant because it's come out at a time when most Jewish institutions have begun to recognize that Sephardic history and narratives are often too underrepresented in Jewish education. So today we will hear about one of these underrepresented Sephardic heritages. I had the honor to write advanced praise for the introduction of Dark Shadows Hover. Jordan Stephen Sher's historical fiction, Dark Shadows Hover, is a superb book based on the true story. While Jordan Sher's biographical fiction, Dark Shadows Hover, is a superb book based on the true story of Sephardic Holocaust survivor and partisan fighter Moris Albahari, who was a Ladino speaker. The book brings to life the often forgotten Sephardic and Balkan narratives of the Holocaust. Sher's book, with a riveting and engaging plot, provides a rare insight into the complexity of Balkan Jewish identity through its account of Moris's life as a teenage Sephardic Jew in the rapidly changing political landscape of 20th century Bosnia, a life that was brutally upended by the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia. Jordan Stephen Sher is the author of 4 books, 3 of which focus on Bosnia. His previous 2 books are a nonfiction and an historical fiction delving into the war in the 1990s that produced war crimes and genocide. His new book, Dark Shadows Hover, is a biographical fiction about Moris Albahari, a young Jewish boy who joined Tito's partisans to fight the Nazis and their collaborators. Jordan is a former middle school English teacher and a social worker prior to that. He lives in San Carlos with his longtime love, having met as freshmen in college. They have 2 wonderful adult children. We now turn the program over to Jordan for today's presentation.
We're interrupting the recording at this point to explain what you're about to see. Due to major computer problems, Jordan's May 18th presentation did not include what he had planned to present. So he revised and updated the presentation on May 19th, and that is the one in this recording. The Q&A session that follows it is the original one from May 18th. Okay, Jordan, it's all yours now. Take over.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about my recently published book, Dark Shadows Hover, which features Moris Albahari. Moris, a real person who was a boy at the time of the Holocaust, and he joined the partisans in Yugoslavia. But I thought it important to give some background on what happened during World War II in Yugoslavia. It was a pretty complicated situation. Okay, to begin with, Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and it was a kingdom, lasted, as you can see, from 1929 to 1941. Yugoslavia itself is in the southeast and central Europe. It is now no longer a country. It is many republics as of the war in Bosnia in the late 1990s, but in 1941, no longer the Kingdom of Yugoslavia once the Germans invaded. And the Germans invaded on April 6th of 1941, and it took them 10 days to conquer Yugoslavia. Okay, so there are several factions in the war in Yugoslavia during the war. So, of course, the Germans, their goal was to dominate all of Europe. They were joined by the Axis powers, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the Bulgarians, all of which were fascists. The Ustaša, which was a fascist terrorist organization in Croatia that joined Germany and was one of Germany's collaborators. The Croatian Home Guard, which was the military force of the army of Croatia at the time, again, part of the Axis powers. And then the partisans, who were communists led by Josip Broz Tito. They were the resistance force, the liberation force, as it were, and we're going to be talking about that. I'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. The Chetniks, who were royalists, and they were solely Orthodox Christian Serbs, and they initially aligned with the partisans to fight the Germans, but soon thereafter split off and were engaged in civil war with the partisans, and the Chetniks aligned with the Germans. And then the US and the UK were allies fighting to support Yugoslavia, and as were the Soviets. But the Soviets, after the end of the war, left the US and UK because they were now a communist bloc and forming their communist bloc. And the Cold War actually ensued right after World War II. Okay, so this is a map of the areas under German or fascist control in 1942. So you could see in all of Europe, it was quite extensive. Okay, so let's look at how Germany partitioned Yugoslavia. Again, once it conquered in 1941, this was April 17th, they set up headquarters in Belgrade, Serbia, and you can see that they took control in terms of administration or overseeing parts of Yugoslavia. Of course, they had the military. Their troops were stationed and occupied throughout Yugoslavia, but this was their primary base initially. Italy was given the coast, the Adriatic coast, to oversee, including southern and eastern Slovenia. So that was their administrative sort of annexed area, and they also stationed military and military operations there. The Ustasha proclaimed Croatia as the independent state of Croatia, or NDH, as you could see. And they were actually a puppet government of Germany. And they controlled or attempted to control Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and parts of Serbia, certainly along with the Germans, because the Germans were the primary military force in all of Yugoslavia. And then Hungary and Bulgaria got smaller regions of control. Okay, so let's look at the fate of the Jews in the hand of the Germans, in Yugoslavia itself. So Jews and Roma were put in detention camps in the NDH. Again, that's the independent state of Croatia, beginning in the summer of 1941. And by the end of the summer, there were uprisings in Serbia and BiH, as Bosnia and Herzegovina, in villages that were initiated by the partisans and the Chetniks, and they were, again, aligned against the Germans initially. And they inflicted in these uprisings in the villages many casualties against the German military personnel. Hitler was quite displeased with this, so he ordered that for every German soldier killed in these uprisings, the Germans would murder 100 civilians. For every German soldier wounded, the Germans would murder 50 civilians, and those civilians were primarily Jews and Roma and communists. And so we see that particularly around the Belgrade, Serbia area, 8,000 Jews were murdered, 2,000 were perceived as communists murdered, and Serb nationalists, and then 1,000 male Roma, and thousands of others were murdered as well. Now, the Germans rounded up 7,000 Jewish women, children, and elderly, again, primarily in Belgrade, Serbia, and they put them in Semlin concentration camp. Hundreds of these people died of disease and hunger, frigid temperatures, and so there were hundreds killed, but then there were still many remaining in the camp. So this all transpired from late winter through the spring of 1942. So the remainder of these people in Semlin were murdered in a gas van, and that was actually a precursor to the gas chambers and concentration camps. And then there were virtually no Jews left in Serbia. Those who did remain, most of whom joined the partisans. Now, this is a picture of the Nazi gas van that was murdering Jews in Belgrade from the Semlin concentration camp. Okay, let's look at the movement. And this really, the partisans, again, under Josip Broz Tito, were initially a guerrilla force, a resistance fighting force against the Axis powers. And again, the Axis are the Germans, Italians, and these are the fascist invaders. So Tito, who was the head of the Communist Party, organized this resistance force. And in fact, we have to note that the partisans became the largest resistance force in all of Europe. Okay, it was a people's movement, and eventually there were 800,000 partisan military personnel. The Germans wanted to destroy the partisan movement because it was getting in their way of dominance in Yugoslavia, certainly, but even in Europe. So they launched these 7 military offenses to counter the growing partisan movement. And liberation of Yugoslavia from the fascists was the main goal of the partisans. So they became, actually, it was the partisans and the Germans were sort of the biggest fight, of these factions that I had mentioned earlier. Okay, so here's a picture of Tito with Jewish resistance leader Mosa Pihada, and he was part of the leadership circle of Josip Broz Tito. I'd mentioned earlier the CPY is the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, and prior to the German invasion, Tito was very active in the Communist Party, and he took on the pseudonym of Tito. And many in the Communist Party in Yugoslavia took on pseudonyms because it was less easy to discover their location by the current government at the point in the kingdom, because the kingdom was arresting communists and imprisoning them. The communists eventually were seen as the only viable group fighting the Nazis and their collaborators. Now, the Serb dominated royalist government. Again, these were those who were loyal to the king, who fled the Yugoslavia after the Germans invaded, and King Peter II was in exile in London, and he and the Chetniks were seen as the legitimate government and fighting force in Yugoslavia, and I'll get to that in a second why they were not after a couple of years. But they were engaged in a civil war, the Chetniks were, with the partisans, and I'll get into that again just a bit more later. So the partisans had 2 early advantages. One is that the Spanish Civil War veterans, and the Spanish Civil War took place during the mid to late 1930s. The veterans of the Spanish Civil War joined the partisans, and they taught the partisan fighters how to engage in battle in very sort of similar terrain, similar tactics, and it was considered modern warfare on the part of the Spanish Civil War veterans, so that helped the partisans. The second was that let me get into this. The second was that this was not an ethnic conflict for the partisans. It was an ideological one. So that communism really was said to include everyone, men and women. You can see in this picture there, women fighters as well. It was, again, a people's movement. Whereas if you look at the Chetniks, it was primarily the Orthodox Christian Serbs looking to create a greater Serbia. That was their goal, an ethnically pure Serbia. So this sort of more ideological rather than ethnic or religiously based group attracted everyone. So they were Catholic, Croats, Orthodox Serb, Christians, Muslim, Jews, non-believers, religious believers were all part of the partisans, and that was also made for a great recruiting tool as well. The partisans were also incredible and expert mountain fighters, which really did help, especially early on, because the Germans were not, and they had a huge military force, of course, and the advanced weaponry, but for the partisans, they could almost sneak in and out of their battles early on, especially because they knew the mountains. Okay, so this is it's a poster that was very popular and hung in the villages in towns and cities throughout Yugoslavia. It was important for the recruitment. And again, here's a picture of a woman, Milja Marin, who was a nurse. But nurses did not avoid fighting either. So they had rifles, they had weapons as well. But it created sort of a very positive image as to this being a true people's movement. Now, here's a photograph taken by the Germans of a 17-year-old nurse who was hung, as you could see, and this is right before her hanging. And this photograph was also hung in villages and towns and cities by the Germans in order to intimidate the people, and with the result, hopefully for them, being that people would not join the movement because this would frighten them. It didn't work out that way. This is a flag that NDH hung, the independent state of Croatia, and it was just for 4 or 5 years. And then once the war ended, of course, this was no longer viable. Okay, so let's look at the NDH and the Ustasha. I mentioned earlier that they're the puppet government of the Nazis. They were quite brutal in their tactics. They actually learned, and I'll talk later about Ante Pavlic, who started the Ustasha, but he learned his tactics from Mussolini and the racial laws as well. So they imposed racial laws, Jews wearing yellow stars, Jews not being able to go to work or to school, and businesses were taken over by the Ustasha, and they were quite an intimidating, and I had mentioned earlier, a terrorist organization. So they were vicious. They also put their non-Aryan enemies in concentration camps, and those were quite brutal as well. So this is Ante Pavlic. I mentioned him earlier. He was appointed as the head, ruler of Croatia during World War II. The NDH did control, as I mentioned again, Croatia, or attempted to, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and some of Serbia. Now, this is the main concentration camp in the independent state of Croatia called Jasenovac. It's still there now, at least there's a memorial to it. But there are approximately 83,000 killed at Jasenovac, and there were also 5 other smaller concentration camps as part of this Jasenovac system, but Jasenovac was the largest. Now, inside and outside the camp, I mentioned before, the militias of the Ustasha were quite brutal, and these were their methods of murder. As you can see, knives, clubs, hammers, axes, and saws. There was some use of gas chambers, but mostly this is what they did. And they also roved, as I mentioned, throughout the countryside and slaughtered non-Aryans. Okay, and the true overall numbers killed by the Ustasha are really unknown. It's said that, this is not just for, excuse me, Jasenovac, but overall during the war, that 352,000 Serbs were murdered, 26,000 Jews, 23,000 Roma. And this is based on this historian. It's also noted that Croatian historians tended to underestimate the numbers of killed, and Serb historians tend to overestimate the numbers killed. Okay, now Draza Mihailovic, who is the head of the Chetniks, he developed this or created this nationalist guerrilla force, again known as the Chetniks. They also exacted numerous atrocities on non-Serb and partisan sympathizers. So they would also, their militias would rove through Yugoslavia and go to Muslim villages and Catholic Croat villages and wipe them out and burn them to the ground. It's said that they killed 68,000 people in their rampage. Now, his goal, I mentioned earlier, was to create a greater Serbia. And this is a goal that was, for centuries, something that Serbia had always strived for. It became very predominant in the mid-1800s, and even as recently as the war in 1990s in Bosnia was to ethnically cleanse Bosnian Muslims to create this greater Serbia. So that's always been part of the goal, I think, of ultra-nationalist Serbs. So Mihailovic, so after Greece and Yugoslavia were defeated by the Germans, and there was a resistance force in Greece, but nothing to the degree of what was in Yugoslavia. As you see here, King Peter II, as I mentioned, was in London. Excuse me, he was viewed, and his government was viewed as legitimate by Winston Churchill and the government of the UK. So the Chetniks and partisans were engaged in civil war not too long after the uprisings in the villages in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. And it turned out later that, after the civil war erupted between the partisans and Chetniks, that the Chetniks actually were aligning with Germany. Winston Churchill sent a top military officer to be with Josip Broz Tito and to learn what was going on with the partisans. And this military officer was quite anti-communist, but he came back to Churchill and said, we need to be supporting the partisans, that the king in exile in London they are not the legitimate government representing the people. Okay, I mentioned before there were 7 German offensives, and primarily each offensive was meant to disable the Tito's resistance, and later on the goal was to capture and kill Tito. But in 1943 is when I'd mentioned when Churchill changed allegiances, and the UK actually would provide support, military support, not so much troops on the ground, but air support, logistics, and military equipment. And then in 1944, the Germans were closing in and capturing Tito in caves in the city of Drvar in Bosnia, and the UK helped the partisans get Tito out of there in 1944. And then when the Italians switched sides in September of 43, they left a good deal of equipment, military equipment, to the partisans. So things were changing, and Germany's strategic plans were not working. Okay, I mentioned the Battle of Neretva, which, as you can see, the date, January to April 1943, was a turning point. It was the 4th German offensive and essentially failed, and because Tito actually was a brilliant military tactician, and he developed a ploy, or created this ploy, that pulled the Germans to another area of the valley of Neretva, so that the wounded, of which there were 4,000, and the partisans themselves could cross the river of Neretva and get to the other side, the eastern side from the west. Tito was known to want to save the wounded and the sick, and he did so very successfully in this battle. His partisans did, of course. And the word spread that Tito was definitely a man who, of the people, who legitimately wanted to liberate Yugoslavia for all. And so it was a good recruitment tool for sure. And many, many more people joined. And this, again, is why this was a turning point. Now, okay, so I had just mentioned that about the numbers of people now joining. So the Germans surrendered in May 7, 1945, and by May 8th, at least, they were not engaged in, there were still some skirmishes, but they were not engaged in battles anymore in Europe. And then May 15th, so a week later, the Ustasha had escaped Sarajevo, and May 15th, finally, their last battle was in Poljana, and that was officially the end for the Ustasha. Okay, so lives lost in Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia probably suffered some of the worst casualties of any of the Allied nations. They had 15.5 million people prior to the war and lost a million. 20,000 Soviet soldiers died during battles to liberate Yugoslavia. And it's kind of difficult to know. I was not able to find actual statistics, the numbers of Allied soldiers killed. So I'm going to transition now to my book, and to Moris Albahari and Dark Shadows Hover. The book title is Dark Shadows Hover. And Moris, this book is considered a biographical fiction, and that Moris really did exist. In fact, he died in October of 2022 at the age of 93. He was a boy at the time in Bosnia, and when the Ustasha took over his city, small city, he eventually We'll get to that story, but he eventually escapes and joins with the partisans, and that's where most of the book explores what it was like for Moris as a young boy in the partisans. So I got these pictures from his son, whose name is David, but goes by the nickname Dado. And Dado gave me a number of pictures, which these are in the book. He had three older siblings. He was born in a place called Sanski Most in Bosnia, and he had three older siblings. Judita was the youngest girl. Flora was the oldest, and Rahila was in the middle. And this is a picture, and you can see little March. And March was the name given to him at birth. He changed his name to Moris after the war. So he was born in Sanski Most. His father, David, had a dry goods store in Sanski Most, and it was not very successful. Eventually, he moved his family, David did, to Drvar. Sanski Most, by the way, had a synagogue and it had a relatively large Jewish population. They were the only Jewish family in Drvar, but they never experienced any anti-Semitism. David and his wife Luna were very well respected in Drvar. People actually sought them out for advice and to talk, and they were quite well known. Now, there was no high school in Drvar, so Judita, Flora, and Rahila were sent to high school in Banja Luka, a nearby city. And Banja Luka also had a Jewish activity center. They were able to, Flora and Rahila graduated from the high school. Around 1940, Judita was to be expelled from school because she was Jewish. And a teacher, advocated on her behalf, and Judita was able to remain to graduate. She moved back to Drvar to be with Moric and her parents. Flora and Rahila moved in with relatives elsewhere in that area because things were heating up, and the Ustasha now were taking control. And again, after the Germans conquered Yugoslavia, the Ustasha were in complete control of Drvar and other villages and areas in that part, northwestern Bosnia at least. David's business had been fairly successful, actually very successful in Drvar. But the Ustasha, and I'm giving a very abbreviated version, this is in my book, but the Ustasha came to his store one day and essentially said, "We now own your store. You'll still work here. We'll take the profits. We'll give you a little bit of food and a few kona, which was the currency they developed. But essentially, this is ours." So the harassment and the oppression had begun. It was it was May of 1941 when David came home early a lot from work because there wasn't a lot of business. And Moric comes racing home through the house from school, and he throws himself on his bed in the bedroom. And David goes in and says, "Well, what?" His son Moric is lying and crying into the pillow, and finally David gets him to turn around, and Moric says, "Dad, or Papa, who was Jesus Christ, and why did the others say that I killed him?" So David, didn't necessarily explain that, of course, but he said, "You don't have to go to school anymore. You just stay here." And then, and it turns out Luna tried to help by bringing various lessons to Moric while he was home. But in July, the family was transported to what's called a collection camp. And this was a concentration camp, was barbed wired, and it was quite horrible, but it wasn't as brutal as the concentration camps that we imagine, or as brutal as Jasenovac, which would evolve into, a very horrific place. But nonetheless, freedom was taken away. Jews were identified as the enemy, and the Albahari family was placed in this concentration camp with 150 other Jews from another nearby city. And there was scarcity of food. They were in very small little quarters. Actually, was a closet sort of size corridor that had been a bathroom. So it was quite something. And there was also there was always the fear of potentially being murdered or raped. There were women and girls who were raped in this camp. Some disappeared. And it was in October of 1941 that all of the Jews from this collection camp were transported to Jasenovac. But in the transport, and it took several hours, and they went to a city called Prijedor, and it took many hours. And these were 75 to 100 people cramped into a cattle car, relieving themselves in the cattle car. There were some who died along the way, and it wasn't much air. It was, quite inhumane, of course. But in Prijedor, there were tracks of this train that were being repaired. And so the prisoners, Jews in the cattle cars, would slowly sneak out because the door was slightly opened because they had to be there for a few days. And they would just sneak out and then come back. They knew they couldn't run because they'd be hunted down. And the day they were to leave to go to Jasenovac, they're on the platform, and Moris's former music teacher was an Ustasha soldier, saw Moric and called him over and had this plan to help Moris escape. And eventually Moris does escape. The story certainly goes on, but you can read about it. But this is where Moric eventually ends up as a partisan as he escapes to the mountains, the Balkans, near Prijedor. Okay, so when he was in the partisans, he had two main roles. One was as a photographer. And as you saw before in the poster, or even what the Nazis were promoting, that intimidating photograph, this was used as the photographs used as recruiting tools and propaganda for both sides, really. And so Moric was assigned. He had never held a camera in his life, never owned a camera, and he was trained to do so. And he would take photographs of his comrades in the camp, some of battle, but he loved photography, and all of his photographs would end up going to the headquarters of the partisans, and he never knew from there, he didn't know where they ended up. So he never was able to keep any. But it was very almost like a refuge to him so that he could get lost in his photography. Now, the more dangerous job was as a courier or a messenger. And there are many stories in the book that feature these dangerous missions of him taking messages to other units, fighting units, or headquarters. He was given the nickname Machi by his comrades, and Machi actually translated means wildcat. Okay, so this is a picture again provided by Dado. Presumably this is after the Italians surrendered and equipment was taken over by the partisans. This is a car called the Topolino, and you could see Moric on the left-hand side of the screen, the car. Okay, this diary page is actually Moric's. He wrote this diary as a partisan. And it's pretty fascinating. I mean, here's a young boy, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, writing his diary. And I was able to use some of these stories in his or diary entries to create my stories about Moric during the war. Dado translated these for me. And what happened, Dado and his mother, Ella, who's Moris's widow, she's still alive, they found 10 diary pages stuffed in a book on a bookshelf in Ella's apartment in Sarajevo. Apparently, during the 1990s war in Bosnia, there was a grenade thrown toward or near their apartment in Sarajevo, and it destroyed some of the apartment, including bookshelf. Books were thrown throughout the room, and Moric found these 10 diary pages that remained, and he picked them up and he hid them in a book. And then Dado and Ella found them as the three of us were looking to discover what Moris's life might have been like as a partisan. Okay, I'm going to show this video from it's a clip from Saved by Language, which is an incredible documentary really focusing on Ladino, because Moric was one of the, or Moris at this point, was one of the last Ladino speakers in Bosnia. So I think you'll find this fascinating, and I hope you actually find on YouTube Saved by Language, because it's quite something.
In 1944, Morris was 14 years old. He was in a field wearing his partisan uniform when he saw a Halifax plane with American and British pilots shot down.
5 men jumping with parachute and come in field where I was. And I see Americans, I go, and when see me, they guns, who are you? And I speak, sprechen Sie Deutsch? Everyone don't speak. Parlate italiano? No. Hablas en español? Clarinco, grincho. Dice, yo hablo español. Me dice, tú say, I have kept with red star, you know. You are partisan, not partisan, I am with partisan. Can you tell me where is commandant, partisan commandant? Yes, I know. I didn't speak English. I used Ladino to speak the Hispanic pilots in their groups, David Garino. That was my only way to communicate. Ladino saved my life in war. Hablas en español, porque yo soy sefardín. Lo que es esto sefardín, no sabes nada. Lo que es esto sefardín, esto es una parte di hebreos dopo la Inquisición que escapada in Turchia ho parlato esto da mia storia. Non sabes nada, that was young people, don't study about that's nothing. Por 20 kilómetros habemos una comanda partisana, e todos, that's 5 pilots, that's 5 equipage from Halifax, with me gone in Ribnik, it's very near the Cluj, and after that, with transport going to seaside in the Adriatic Sea and going with ship in Bari.
Okay, so as you can see, David and Luna did survive. They had remained on the train to Jasenovac, and again, part of the story that you'll read in Dark Shadows Hover is how they were able to stay alive. But this is a picture of the 3 of them in 1945. And Moris was quite the adventurer. He had a motorcycle. He kind of has a Marlon Brando little look, or James Dean, and he toured around Yugoslavia and around Europe on his motorcycle after this picture we're seeing is 1955. There was something that he had wanted to do, and he did. I just thought this was kind of a cool picture and tells you a little bit about Moris. Okay, he loved aviation. As a young boy, his father would give him some military magazines, and he'd see planes, and that was sort of a love of his. And there's a chapter in the book where he meets a very famous Croatian pilot who began the partisan Air Force, and he defected from Croatia and stayed with Moris's unit for a month. Moris got to know him and learn from him even at the age of 12 or 13. And eventually Moris became a pilot trainer, and he trained pilots at what was called Butimir Airfield, which eventually became the Sarajevo International Airport, of which later Moris was, not even later, he was a technical director at the airport and helped to create this new facility at the time in the 1970s. Here's a little faded picture of Moris, and Ella. This is taken around 1960. I think Dado told me they met at a Purim party in Sarajevo. This is a little clearer picture of the two of them, married in 1961, and then Dado was born in 1964. Here's a picture of Moris, who was a great advocate for interreligious peace. He was he was a part of the Interreligious Council in Sarajevo. And after the 1990s war, he met with the Pope. I had asked Dado, do you know what they spoke about? And he said to me, no, my father said they just told jokes. Okay, here's another picture of 35 years of marriage. And they were both, Moris and Luna were very involved in the Jewish Community Center, and they helped to preserve the Sephardic culture in Sarajevo. That was very, very important, certainly, to them. Again, this is a picture in 2014 of Moris and Dado. And I'm going to play, after Moris died, the World Jewish Congress put out this video. I'm going to end the presentation with just showing you a picture of the book cover. There's a QR code, but I really do hope you get a chance to read about what happened in Yugoslavia, and primarily about Moris. It was fascinating for me. It was fascinating for me to learn about Moric early on, and then Moris later on, to learn about what happened during the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. And as a former middle school teacher and social worker, I was deeply interested in how a child soldier, particularly Moris, had hid his Jewish identity during the war. He didn't know where his family was, and he was engaged in some, tremendously horrific battles. And even when he wasn't, living with his unit, his partisan unit, just found it fascinating that he was able to survive and do what he did, especially later in his life. So I want to thank you for being here, and I'll just let Mindy I guess, or Jerry, take over.
Okay, thank you very much. Mindy, are you still there? Do you have any
Yeah,
questions?
I'm still
I want to say
there.
a few things.
Yeah, I do. These are questions for Jordan. Okay, you've talked a bit about the diary that was found, and through that you got some extraordinary personal recountings. Where did you get the material that was not in the diaries? You just sketched out a very elaborate story of what Morris was up to. So some of that was in the diary, but how did you find out some of the other things that were not?
Well, some of it, Ella and Dotto, they knew bits and pieces, so they would share that with me. And I'll give you an example. I mean, well, yeah, they would share bits and pieces and I would create a story around that. But the other was I mentioned Saved by Language, which really is 2017, I think was a documentary was made, 53 minutes, and it's primarily about how Ladino saved Morris during the war. And it's fascinating. If you get a chance, please go to YouTube and find it. So I got information from that. And I was also able to find 5 interviews done at the Shoah Foundation of Morris in Serbo-Croatian. And so it was almost as if I'm just, I'm watching these, and the Shoah Foundation very generously loaned them to me. Normally they don't do that. And then I have a friend in upstate New York who's Bosnian, and he put English subtitles to these 5 videotapes. And so Morris, in a sense, I'm learning from him directly. And so those were those are things I was able to put into the story itself, into the book. Also, I found an article that Judita, his sister, Morris's sister, had written that plays some important part in the book as well. And then, like I said, a bunch of it, because I was a social worker and middle school teacher, and I understood the developmental issues that adolescents go through. I mean, I was able to sort of examine that and weave through Morris's own experiences what it must have been like for him, as a child in this very traumatic situation.
Let me interrupt for a second, Mindy, before people leave. 2 things. There'll be a lot more information coming out later with the email and other things, but I want to mention one other thing, that there's a lot of good information in the chat, including this lady, Robin Helsner, who is a local cantor in the Washington area, and she leads tours of Jewish areas in the world. And she's going to, according to the chat, she's going to do a tour of this area of Yugoslavia, I believe, in June. So I will put information about that on how to contact her in the email also. And Robin, do you want to say something about that before we go on too much further? Because that's very timely. That's why I wanted to interrupt and see if you wanted to say anything.
Is she muted, Jerry?
She can unmute herself if she wants. Are you there, Robin? I don't see her. Okay.
Jerry, I wanted to also one other thing, and
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to ask you if this particular PowerPoint, these slides on Morris, if I convert them to PDF and send them to you, is it possible to send these out to the participants so they could
We will figure out afterwards how to get the information to people, whether it's a PowerPoint or PDF. You and I will figure that out later. Let's not worry about that right now.
Robin has just sent a note to chat. She cannot mute.
Okay, somehow. Hi, it's Robin.
Okay.
So I'm not going to put my video on at the moment, but I just want to thank you, Jerry, and for just acknowledging me. Yes, I have really become connected to this part of the world, and this is, I think, the 3rd or 4th trip that I'm taking to Croatia and to Bosnia to visit the Jewish sites, the important Jewish sites. The Jewish communities in both the countries, Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, are swiftly decreasing. And so it's important that we visit these places to acknowledge that we've been there for centuries. There are synagogues in Dubrovnik, Split, and Sarajevo that were built in the 16th century that are still standing, that are amazing. And as I also, so in addition to visiting these sites, I also share the music of the Jews who lived in this area, predominantly songs in Ladino, in Judeo-Espanol. And we sing in every synagogue. When I take my groups, we sing in every synagogue to bring the Jewish music back to these places where the communities once flourished. And also, I mentioned that we visit the Jasenovac concentration camp in Croatia and hold a memorial service for the Jews that were brutally murdered there. So, Jerry, if you want to just in your information, just you can share my email address, and if people are interested, they can get in touch with me. But it's a fascinating area of the world, and unfortunately, ultimately tragic for the Jewish communities that lived there.
Okay, afterwards, Robin, I want to correspond with you before I give the information out. But that'll be afterwards. Okay, I'm sorry for the interruption, but that was very timely.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Okay, the volume could be increased here. We hear from Gladys Horowitz. All right, let me get back to a more literary type question, Jordan. I think you've well sketched out, as far as you could, the life of Moris. But I'd like to hear more of how you interpolated the richness of a lived life with your quasi-fictionalization of it. Talk about how you worked out the process and where your imagination took off and where reality came in.
I think for me, and again, having read and learned a lot about what happened in the Balkans during the Holocaust, so I wove, that through my understanding of the psychosocial development of young, of adolescents, and taking the bits and pieces, like I said, of what I knew about Moris, and creating as real, as true life, I guess, a story as I can. Because, initially when I learned about Moris, there really was nobody who fought with him in the partisans who we could find who was alive then. So I had to take what I had and the knowledge I have about the area, for example, and the knowledge I have or I had learned about the Holocaust, and then it's one of those things, try to put myself in his situation, as best I could. And I really couldn't imagine how I would have been. But then, like I said, also understanding as best I could, how can I fashion these different scenes and stories about him, and seeing the interviews, seeing the documentaries, talking to other people, reading articles about Moris, I was able to just, I don't know, it was strange because I was almost feeling, I felt his presence. I know maybe sounds odd, but I felt his presence as I was writing the story. And I said, this is something I could see him doing based on what I've learned about him, both through his interviews and what people, what his family had told me.
Okay, again, to touch base on the reality here, how did his relatives feel about what you did, the transposing of Moris's reality to your quasi-fictional account?
Yeah, and I do call it a biographical fiction. You're right. No, Dado and Ella were extremely supportive, and part of it is they were sort of in research mode as well as I was, because they wanted to learn more about his life. So we combined those efforts, and I know they were very supportive and honored, that that I would want to write a book about him. And actually, Dotto would say periodically, I don't know why anybody would want to, read about, Moris. There are thousands of resistance fighters and whatnot. And I said, because your father was quite something, and he was quite fascinating, and he has a story to tell that really maybe in some ways represents what the Sephardim went through, represents certainly what an adolescent went through, represents what the Holocaust was like in Yugoslavia. And so it's certainly about Moris, but it can be expanded to this is the experience that took place in Yugoslavia.
Okay, so the book was now translated into several languages, is that correct?
No.
Hmm?
No, it was not. It's still in English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So no, it was not.
Are you looking for it to be translated?
That costs money. It does. And even like Audible, people have told me they nowadays, because of our fast-paced society, they listen to Audible. There's a labor of love. I don't ever anticipate making money off it. It's not my goal. My goal is for people to learn about, because there isn't a lot written about, but to learn about what happened in Yugoslavia to Jews through the eyes of Moris. But at this point, financially, I'm not able to do that. Now, I don't know. Maybe there'll be somebody in Sarajevo who says, "Yeah, let's we'll help you out and we'll have it translated into Bosnian." But at this point, no, it's English.
Now you mentioned you have gone there to that area a few times. Did you talk about your book there?
No, I have not been there yet, and I'm embarrassed to say. I know the rabbi said she's been there a few times on her excursions, but I've been writing about Bosnia, and like I said, particularly the war in the early 90s. I have 2 books about that, and I got to know lots of people and the tragedy there. Maybe some of you know of the Srebrenica genocide. Muslims, or Bosniaks as they're called, were targeted by ultranationalist Serbs. And I have been saying, I need to go to Bosnia. I need to go to Bosnia. And now, especially now, because of this recent book that I wrote, I am planning on going, not this summer, but next summer. I'm going to go to Bosnia and Croatia likely. So I am going to go finally go there and see what it is, where it is literally that I've written about, for 3 books.
Okay, somehow I thought you were there. Okay, you talked about the reaction particularly by his son. What about reactions to the people in these communities you mentioned? Now, I realize it's in English, and I don't know how the book has spread beyond the English-speaking world, but say a little bit about how it has reached some of the communities you discuss in the book.
I really don't know. Now, I've had contact with one of the Jewish community leaders in Sarajevo, and he was planning on either having me present, but he said most of the people there now are older and they do not speak English and they're not very savvy at Zoom. Clearly, I'm not very savvy at Zoom, but they're not very savvy at Zoom. And so we're going to have to work that out. One of the things he's considering, if we do a presentation, he would then put it on their YouTube channel and they could put subtitles in Bosnian. So I don't, honestly, I don't have any sense of how it's doing outside English-speaking folks.
Well, I hope it happens. We don't have much time left, and I do want to say in the chat, there were all kinds of interesting interventions. A number of people have relatives there. They wanted to at least mention that. Some people have traveled. Oh, yeah, somebody here talks about you're going to GoFundMe to seek some remuneration. Think about that. We also had a rather extensive commentary by Yitzhak Kerem. I'm not sure you're familiar with him, but you might want to look him up. I gather he's written a fair bit on that. Strikes me he's probably a historian. So consider that. And as we close here, Jordan, are there any final words you'd like to say on the whole process of creating this book and what you learned and what you would share with others who want to go on that kind of journey, using history, using story techniques, and marrying lived reality with fictionalization.
First of all, as we all know, Holocaust survivors are many are dying, are dead, and there are very few remaining. And I think it's incredibly important. And there are certainly organizations, next generations, I think second, third generation, who are writing about their ancestors who are Holocaust victims or survivors. But that is something I think we need to absolutely keep alive, especially, we're seeing a rise in fascism around the world. And I think it's very important that we understand what the result can be. So, I learned that, I'm very, like I said, I'd written about the war in the 90s, but I became very much more, for me personally, tied into what happened in the Holocaust, because I'm Ashkenazi. I know a bit about what happened to my family. Really, I didn't know a whole lot about the Sephardim either. But I think, to your question, people who have those stories to share, if they're feeling comfortable to write, there's my publishers, Amsterdam Publishers. They're solely dedicated to writing books about that Holocaust memoir or some fiction. I would encourage you to support Amsterdam Publishers. So read more about it, become more educated about, about the Holocaust from these different types of stories like mine.
Okay, I can't let you go without asking a little bit about the role of Ladino in these journeys. People use this to communicate, I gather. Anything else you want to say about that?
Again, in the documentary Saved by Language, Moris specifically talks about, and I did create some stories around the stories he tells in that documentary. From what I understand, it's a language that not many people speak, and you all who are involved in in Shin and other Sephardic organizations certainly know that. It's I think it's important to know about the two primary subgroups, cultural groups of Judaism, not just Ashkenazi, which tends to be sort of more dominant, but the Sephardim have a fascinating history and language and music. And just out of curiosity, I would encourage you all to find out more about the Sephardic Jews.
Okay, a lot to think about, some very interesting interventions in the chat, family histories, grandfathers who had businesses and others who had other involvements in life there. Okay, now Jerry may want to say some final words. And again, thanks so much, Jordan. It's been a fascinating journey that you've taken us on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you, Mindy. And I have one question, then I'll also ask Ephraim if he wants to say something. Moris obviously survived the Holocaust and became a very esteemed person in his community. You say it's a few words about after the Holocaust, but I think Moris did some very distinguished things in his afterlife after the Holocaust was over.
Yeah, one of the things he was very dedicated to, in addition to preserving Sephardic heritage and culture, he was involved in Interreligious Council of Sarajevo and very much believed in mutual respect. And he and his son interviews said, those who believe, he said, all of us believe in a God or gods. He said, there's that really should bond us rather than separating us. No religion is better than the others. And he very much promoted that, tried to promote interreligious harmony. At one point, and I had a slide which unfortunately I couldn't show, but he met the Pope after 1995. He met the Pope who came to visit Sarajevo. And there's a picture of him shaking the hand of the Pope. And the reason he met is because he was representing this interreligious council. And I asked Dotto, what did he and the Pope talk about? And he said, my father told me we just told jokes. That was the kind of, that was Moris. He was, a character, but in a very loving, kind of sweet way.
That was very nice. Okay. The only thing I'm going to say now, again, thank you very much. And I'll mention that many times already. We will find a way for that information to get to the people who have registered. Which way, we don't know yet. You and I will talk later. We'll figure that out. The next class we have right now, the next class schedule, it is a month from now, in June 22nd. It'll be about an art museum, which is also a Holocaust museum in Quito, Ecuador, which we had a class about that museum actually about a year or two ago. But the young woman who's involved now, who's a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I think, she'll be talking about how she used her art to explain to people about the Holocaust and to combat hatred and things of that nature. So that'll be in June 22nd. It won't be about Sephardic. It'll be more Ashkenazi because her parents came from Chile, from Czechoslovakia. Okay. Ephraim, do you want to...
One minute, Jerry. There's a fascinating intervention by Ivan Illich about a World Federation of Jewish child survivors and descendants in Paris in September. Some of you who are listening might find that interesting. And Yvonne has her email here, which we could send, yillich@comcast.net, holocaustchild.org.
There's a lot of good information, including that, in the chat. I expect to actually send a copy of the chat to people. If you put something in the chat which you do not want to be sent to everyone, tell me. Otherwise, I'm gonna put almost everything in the chat, so people will have all that also. A lot of information will be coming to all the registered students. Not only this recording. Ephraim, do you want to say something?
Let me unmute myself. I just want to say thank you to Jordan. This is very important work. These are, underrepresented narratives, and so it's so important to get these stories out there so more people know about them. And just to let people know something we have coming up. We do our annual Congressional Holocaust commemoration on the Hill, usually in January. And this year we've added a new program remembering over 2,600 years of Iraqi Jewish life, and also remembering the Farhud. And that's going to be on the Hill on June 5th. And we'll send people more information about that.
And let me add, by the way, since this class is co-sponsored by both organizations, unless you tell me otherwise, everybody's email will also be going to the Sephardic Heritage. So they'll send you updates and things of that nature. But if you don't want your email to go there, just write to me, email to me at the Jewish Studies Center.org, and I will not do it. Anyway, I expect that you'll be getting various updates from both the Jewish Studies Society and by the Sephardic Heritage International. Okay, I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties, but we will try to get a lot of information to you one way or the other. Okay, thank you again, Ephraim, for sharing this great story, and especially to Jordan, who wrote the story up. And not only wrote it up, he did a lot of research, various ways, even though he didn't know. You don't know a lot of Ladino, right?
I don't even speak.
Your wife does, I assume, but she speaks.
No.
She doesn't either. That's right. But anyway, with all the language problems, you still managed to write a great book about Morris. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks for everybody who wrote into the chat.
Let me
And
say one more thing.
People will be receiving the chat also. I'll figure out how to do that.
I'll
Okay.
say one more thing. We
Okay.
have a Ladino concert at the Library of Congress on Wednesday. So that's something also let people know about.
Nice.
Well, Afram, when I send you all the emails, you can send a update to people about that event plus others. Okay,
Okay, so
I'm ending it now.
no, but thank you. And Jerry and Ephraim, let's talk about
Yeah,
it
we'll talk. We'll talk.
so much.